Hermes was dying, and he knew it. His engines were overheating and there was nothing anyone can do about it. He drifted through space. So this is how it would end. Leaving this world without Bianca. Without his navigator. And so far from home. He felt guilty about how he'd left her. It was the first time he'd lied to her. But it was only to save her. She deserved to live. Even if it was without him. Even if she would need to find her way in life alone. When the accident happened, he had told her to go to the repair shuttle to try to help him. Even if he knew it wasn't possible. His hull had been too damaged. But she didn't know it then. So when he told her to leave for the shuttle, to help him from the outside, she had gone. The chances of her surviving were almost zero. But still, there was a chance. Had he been wrong in his next actions? There hadn't been any logic to them. But he just wanted to die with the hope that Bianca would be okay. So when she'd reached the shuttle, he'd shot her as far away from him as he could. He hoped she would be safe now. That she would find her way. Hermes. That was his name. Not a machine. Not a simple spaceship with a computer's mind that had been programmed to have feelings and to care. No. He was a dream ship. A living, feeling being. Silly, even for being a dream ship. But it didn't matter. His name was chosen to connect to his past, to his ancestors, and to that first space shuttle that had left Earth's gravitational field such a long time ago. Together with Bianca, he traveled through the dream. But no more. Where was she now? Was she on her way? He hoped so. One of his engines caught fire, and he knew it was time to leave. His last thoughts stayed with Bianca, as he brought all the powers to his engines. And for the last time, he traveled to the dream. The place where he was born. When Bianca felt the connection break, she screamed in her small shuttle. Almost instantly, there was a hollow inside of her, and she knew Hermes was gone, knew that he had gone back to the dream world. She wanted to follow him, wanted to turn the shuttle around and go where he had gone. But she knew she couldn't. It didn't work that way. He wouldn't bring her to him. For the first time in many years, she was alone. And he wasn't there to help her. Her emotions, feelings, and everything that made her into a navigator, she would have to deal with herself. He'd always been there, being by her side when her emotions rose inside of her, when they overtook her, and when they subdued, leaving her trembling. Those emotions made her into the navigator she was, and she needed them to steer through the dream world. Hermes made that possible. The connection inside her heart, helping her. But not any longer. She was alone, broken, and with a hollow in her chest. She looked around her tiny shuttle. He must have wanted to save her, she thought. He must have been more damaged than he told her, and done what he could to rescue her. She never thought this would happen. That she would live her life without him. That he wouldn't be there, inside of her. But there was nothing she could do. Nothing that would bring him back. The sadness drifted away, and for a moment, acceptance washed over her. She dried her tears. Navigators, peculiar beings, their emotions flowed as quickly and nimble as water in the river, starting to cry as quickly as they stopped. And you might have experienced it yourself, how emotions, flowing through you, simply wanted to find a way out and be released. That is how it was to be a navigator. They were special, as you might have understood, mortal, just like you. But the world they lived in was inhabited by immortals, beings with computerized memories and biomechanical bodies. Once, they too had been human. But as they left Earth, and the new planet became their home, they began to change. Slowly, over the centuries, they found a way to replace their bodily parts with mechanical ones. And little at a time, their life had changed, and they became immortal. But the price they paid, no one could have foreseen. Their emotions vanished, disappearing, and they were left with an intellectual, sharp mind that saw the world through a lens of serenity. They didn't cry, and they didn't understand navigators and their emotions. But they didn't shun them, far from it. Navigators were born in that world, and were citizens of the society. And immortals, as highly evolved as they had become, didn't know how to travel the dream, nor how to connect with the dream ship. But the gap between them, the void between those who felt and those who didn't, made navigators feel misunderstood, and immortals uncomfortable. That was the world that Bianca had grown up in. Never truly at home, never truly understood. There were many days when she had cried, but more often than not, she'd accepted it, as the navigator she was. Nothing could be done about it. Nothing that she did would change it. But it didn't stop her from feeling lonely. All that changed when she met Hermes. She still remembered it. The day when her loneliness had disappeared. When she stopped feeling misunderstood. When he had moved into her. Their bond had been established. And she became his navigator. And Hermes became her home, her family, and a part of her. Her life had taken on a new meaning then. And the loneliness became a thing of the past. Until today, when Hermes disappeared, and she was left alone, traveling through space. What would she do? Their home lay many light years away, and there were no livable planets within reach. She thought about Hermes. What had he wanted her to do? Well, she knew that. He had wanted her to live. And as his navigator, there was nothing more she wanted than to make him happy, to feel his love. After that, the choice became easy. She would live. Even though she might never find a way to fill that hollow in her heart, at least she would stay alive. One more day, one at a time. And that's how her travels began. To a destination yet unknown. She didn't have a plan. Didn't know where she was going. But she had to live to see another day. The distress signal she'd sent out would take many years to reach her world. But in the end, you never knew. Someone might find her. Someone might come to rescue her, even if the chances were slim. And so, the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and she kept traveling. The thought of Hermes stayed with her, stayed in her heart and in her mind, just like the hollow. But she kept going, holding on to his last wish. More than once, she cried, overwhelmed by the thought of having to live without him. But once the sadness was gone, and she was left trembling in the tiny shuttle, she knew she had to continue, knew she had to keep living for another day. And so she did. What happened next? No one could have predicted. Because you see, Hermes had been right. The chances of her being rescued were almost zero. And in the end, there was no soul spaceship or a fleet of dream ships in search of a lost navigator that found her. Instead, one day, many months after Hermes had shot her from him, the radar beeped on the shuttle's dashboard. An object had been found, located several days from her. She stared at her screen until her eyes ached. It was a sight she never thought she would see, and the tears that fell made the image blurry. Those were tears of sadness, because Hermes wasn't there to see it, and tears of happiness, because they'd found what they'd been searching for. Because the image on the radar screen showed the signature of Einstein, the first colonial ship that had left Earth 10 centuries ago. It was the ship that the scientists had wanted to find, and the reason to why Hermes and she had been traveling through space all these years. No one knew what had happened to it, or if the people on board were still alive. Most ships leaving Earth had reached their destination, but Einstein wasn't one of them. No one knew why. But it was her only chance of rescue, and she put the shuttle on course towards it. During those days, until the ship could be seen outside of her window, she thought about Hermes. He'd been so excited to meet what he called his ancestor. Dream ships were not built, of course, but still, he thought about all ships that had come before him as his ancestors. Now he would never see it. Those days, as she traveled to Einstein, she would always remember them with an odd mixture of sadness and relief. When the silhouette of the ship appeared outside the window, she put the shuttle in an orbit around it. "I will keep living for you, Hermes," she whispered. The windows of Einstein were dark, and the vessel seemed to be drifting. She put on her spacesuit and exited the shuttle, drifting towards the dark ship. As she reached the lock, she looked back at her transportation. "Hermes, I'm doing it." She took a deep breath, turned to Einstein, and opened the airlock. The bridge was cold, and Alicia sat shivering by the dashboard, the logbook open on the screen in front of her. She squinted in the faint light, because apart from a few scattered lights on the console, the bridge lay in darkness. It had been like that ever since the accident. She sat writing today's entry, keeping the logbook updated, despite it not being anything new to add. Still, she would do as the captains before her had done, following their footsteps and doing the duty that they had set. She'd read about it in the entries from the past, that had captains serving for many years. but it was a long time ago. Nowadays, the role was rotated between the crew, with each month a new one. It didn't matter. They would follow the traditions, taking the responsibility that came with that in earnest. She added the last information and looked through the entries she'd written. Date, 25th of September, 2385. Location, unknown. Crew members, 146. Destination, new home. She added their position and time as the last and clicked save. Next to her, Jeff was sleeping in his seat, a blanket over his lap. The old man didn't like the cold, and spent most of the time on the chair, fending off the chill of the unheated room. As her first officer, they held the watch together, following the traditions of their ancestors, even though he wasn't needed any longer. He was mostly there to keep her company now, sleeping away his shifts. She didn't mind it. Just like the rest of the crew, she simply wanted to follow the traditions laid out by their ancestors. It gave her a purpose, a feeling of safety. A panel by her feet fell to the floor, and she picked it up, securing it again. There had been a lot of repairs done to the bridge over the years, just like the rest of the ship. And she wished she could have seen the images of how it had been when the ship was new, when everything was in order, and no loose ends or cables were sticking out, and the panels stayed where you had put them. They'd done the best they could over the years, repairing what broke down, but she wondered if the first generation would have recognized it. She reached for the glass of water by the dashboard and took a sip. Moments later, she coughed and spit it out, the water spilling over the floor. Her throat was tingling, and she raised the glass to the light of the console. The water was clear, but it had left a grainy residue in her mouth. Just like last month, when the water filter had to be cleaned. Was it needed again? It shouldn't be. Not this often. The ship was old. Of course, she knew that. And there was always something to repair. After all, they had been traveling for many hundreds of years longer than expected. And ever since the accident, centuries ago, the ship had been crumbling. But still, the repairs were getting too frequent now, and it was only a matter of time until something vital broke. She didn't want to think about it. They didn't have a solution for when that day came. She looked at the glass of water standing next to her. What could it be this time? The filter? The pump? Or something else altogether? It wasn't urgent, and she made a note to talk to the others, asking them to have a look. She turned back to the screen and the logbook. It was the privilege of the captain to use the computer, even though they were restricted in their power usage. In the long stretches of waiting between repairs, it was the only thing you could occupy yourself with, and she often read the entries from the past during her shifts. She read about how it had been before the accident, 100 years in the past, and how those days had looked like when the number of crew members was still 10,000. There wasn't much happening in those stories. Mostly daily chores and data were noted down. But just as following the traditions, it gave Alicia a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging to something bigger and continuing that journey that had been started almost 10 centuries ago. Not that there was much left of that original vision. They mostly try to survive nowadays, but you could still feel the pride among the crew for having made it so far, for following what their ancestors had set out to do. Even if the hopes of them ever succeeding were slim, almost non-existent by now. The computer was full of other books too, apart from the logbook, but Alicia had stopped bothering with them a long time ago. Only Kim ever read them nowadays, but she knew he never managed to make full sense of them either. When their ancestors had set out, leaving on their mission of finding a new place for humanity in space, all the information thought to be needed to survive and prosper had been given in those books. In the past, she tried to read them, but it quickly became overwhelming. They spoke about things like the ocean and caves, and Alicia had just given up trying to understand what it meant. Now, it was only the logbook that she read, and it brought comfort to her long days. A light suddenly began to blink on the dashboard, and she tensed. Those never brought any good news, and she preferred when the console was dark and nothing caught her attention. Maybe it's just a shortcut to the airlock, she tried to tell herself. Some electrical systems failing again. She needed to have a look. She woke Jeff, telling him that she needed to go. He nodded, reminding her to be quick about it, because if something was wrong, they couldn't afford to lose too much power. She knew it, of course, but didn't say anything, and instead assured him that she would hurry up. She picked up the toolbox and torch on her way out, and stepped out into the dark corridors. Even with the torch, it was difficult to see the road ahead, but Alicia was used to it. The darkness didn't scare her. After all, she had grown up with it, just like everyone else on board. No, it wasn't the darkness that followed them into their dreams, but the state of the ship. After the accident, when one of their reactors had exploded, they had lost half of their power supply. Shortly after, for fear of what had happened, the crew had turned off the remaining one. Now, only the solar panels provided them with electricity, but they weren't enough, this deep into space. So the ship had been left dark, with its heating turned off, and most of the rooms closed down. Only the biosphere had something that still resembled life, although over the years, it was slowly dying as well. The rain fell less often, and it was getting drier. No one talked about it, but everyone knew that they didn't have many years left. If they didn't find somewhere to dock, or find a way to power up the ship again, they wouldn't make it. There was no solution at hand. But they would tell each other that they would find one, that one surely would come up. And it was the mantra that Alicia kept repeating now, as she walked down the dark corridor. As she was drawing closer to the airlock, she rounded a corner and came to a sudden halt. Further down the passage was a light, filling up the hallway and shining as if the air itself was lit. It pulsated in the dark space, and she raised her hand to shield her eyes. For a moment, she wondered if the remaining reactor had gone. But it wasn't the light she'd read about in the logbooks, and she dismissed the thought. She took a step forward. It wasn't the normal service light, or the main light either. She'd seen them. Once a year they were lit, on Memorial Day. No, this was something else. She took another step forward, curious rather than afraid. And as she got closer, the light suddenly dimmed, and she saw someone standing in the middle. It was a woman, covered in a suit of something that resembled liquid metal. It glinted in the light, and seemed to flow over her body. Alicia slowed down to a halt. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The woman didn't reply. She stood with her eyes closed, swaying on the spot when suddenly the light went out. In the light from the torch, Alicia saw her falling to her knees, sobbing. She rushed forward, forgetting all caution, and took her in her arms and pulled her close. The embrace didn't last long. Almost as quickly as it had begun, the woman stopped crying and dried her tears. Alicia looked at her. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," Hermes died. We had an accident. The words triggered memories of the logbook, and Alicia tensed up. What had happened? How many had they lost? And was there still someone out there, lost after the ship had broken? Or was the woman alone? She trembled as she asked, "Is there someone else with you?" The woman shook her head, and the entries from the accident flashed before Alicia. No, it couldn't be. Not another accident. Not leaving this woman alone. It wasn't fair. She fought against her tears when the words from the captains of the past spoke to her from the entries, and she took a deep breath. They had been here too, in the same situation. What had they done? They had cared for the others. They had been there for them. She took a deep breath. She would do the same. She swallowed her tears and looked at the woman. She didn't seem to be hurt, at least not physically. Still, she would have to get her checked. She took her hand and helped her stand, pushing the questions that begged to be answered away. "Come," she said. "I'll take you to the medical unit. I'm Alicia, captain of the month. You come to Einstein. You're safe here." The woman nodded, and they began to walk down the dark corridor. Alicia couldn't keep her thoughts still any longer, and question after question whirled around in her mind. Who were they? Was someone looking for them? Would they be rescued? She glanced at the woman. Her gaze was vacant as she walked, and Alicia wondered if she was aware of where she was any longer. The questions pushed at her mind, and she opened her mouth to speak only to close it again. No, you can't ask her those questions yet, she thought. Wait until she feels better. So instead, she said, "Were there others with you?" "Yes." Alicia pushed back the tears that rose at the thought of what had happened and turned to the woman, taking her hands. "I'm sorry." The woman just nodded in reply, and they continued down the dark corridor. As they arrived at the medical unit, they stepped inside and an automatic light went on. It revealed a room full of machines lining the walls. They were barely used any longer, and dust had settled over the surfaces. None of the people on board knew how to operate those machines any longer, and the doctors that had been on the ship had long since died or perished in the accident. The only thing that had been passed down through the generations was how to check for radiation damage. Alicia gestured at the woman to stand in the machine closest to her, praying that Jeff was still asleep. She didn't want him to try to walk all the way here to check what was taking the electricity. It was such a long walk for an old man. She pressed the button, and the machine came to life, slowly rotating around the woman's body. She stood watching the room now, curiously serene, as if she had all the time in the world and just wanted to observe it. She must be in shock, Alicia thought. Was it too late already? Would the woman die the kind of horrible death that she had read about in the logbook? She took a deep breath but couldn't stop the tears from spilling over. "Why are you crying? Has something happened?" The woman calmly turned to her, and Alicia looked at her through the tears. "I need to take her to Jeff when this is done," she thought. "Ask him what to do about the shock." She dried her tears and heard a beep from the machine, signaling that the scan was done. She looked at the screen, searching for the information she knew how to interpret. When she found it, it showed her that the woman was clean. There was no radiation damage. She breathed a sigh of relief, then gestured for her to step out. Taking her hand, Alicia asked, "What's your name?" They walked back to the bridge in silence, Alicia holding Bianca's hand for comfort. She was calmly watching her surroundings, and once again Alicia wondered if she was still aware of where she was. She thought back on the captains of the past, and decided that she would be there for Bianca, whatever she needed. Does it seem strange to you? Did Alicia care so much for this stranger? Maybe. But the people of Einstein had learned the hard way what it meant to be there for others. You see, it hadn't always been like this. In the entries of the logbook, in the more personal notes from the captains, you could read about the change that had happened after the accident. In the first centuries, before, as the ship was new, it was the dream that held them together. Their vision of finding somewhere to settle and a new place for humanity. That vision brought them forward, formed friendships, and built the ship. Back then, the ship had bustled with people, and not everyone knew each other. There were way too many members to know each one personally. But all that had changed after the accident. That day, they had lost many members, and in the aftermath, even more. Almost everyone had lost someone from their family. And the dream had changed, going from finding somewhere to settle to surviving. The original vision only lived on the pages of the logbook now. And as you can imagine, such an accident doesn't leave the people untouched. That's what the entries from the captains spoke about. How they became a family after the accident, regardless of their biological bond. Care for each other came naturally, and it was extended to everyone. They arrived at the bridge, and as they entered, Alicia saw that Jeff was still sleeping in his chair. Relieved to see that he didn't seem to have noticed the extra power usage, she walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Jeff, wake up." He stared, slowly opening his eyes, and smiled. "Did you fix it?" he asked. "No, I found someone." Jeff looked at her, confused. "Found someone? What do you mean?" Alicia took a step aside, revealing Bianca standing some distance away. Jeff squinted, trying to make out her features in the poorly lit room. Alicia put a hand on his shoulder. "They had an accident. She's the sole survivor." He pushed himself from the chair and hobbled over to Bianca, one hand stretched out to greet her. She didn't take it, or show any signs that she had seen it. Unmoved, Jeff wrapped his arm around her shoulders instead and gestured towards the chair. "Please, sit," he said. "Everything is okay. You're safe now." Bianca walked over to the chair and sat down, and he put his blanket around her. She looked at it. "I'm not cold," she said. Jeff and Alicia exchanged looks. She really is in shock, Alicia thought. Jeff said, "Is she okay?" Alicia understood what he asked about and nodded. "I ran her through the machine. She's free from radiation." He nodded. "Go and tell the others," he said. "I will stay here." Alicia nodded and left for the biosphere. When Alicia had left, Jeff sat down next to Bianca and took her hand in his. "It will be okay," he said. Whatever happened to you, we're here for you. You're safe here, and you can stay here. Maybe Alicia already told you, but we had an accident too, on this ship. My grandfather was only a child then, but he told me stories about it. It was a horrible time, but I think it also brought us closer. A silver lining in the cloud, I guess. She looked at him, her gaze vacant. Her hand was still in his, and he assumed she was listening the best she could in her state of shock. They sat in silence for a while. But Jeff didn't want it to linger, and decided it was time to talk about a happier period, how it had been before the accident. One of his favorite stories was about Dallas, the first captain of the ship. Jeff had read about him and the time he lived in countless times in the logbook. In truth, they weren't very exciting stories per se. There wasn't much happening at the beginning of Einstein's journey. But just as for Alicia, it was the exact reason he liked those stories, and why he kept telling them. In the meantime, Alicia entered the biosphere and let her eyes adjust to the light. It was a vast space, meant for cultivating their food. But after the accident, as their members declined, it had grown wild, and now it looked more like a forest than anything else. She knew it was slowly dying from lack of rain, but it still held on, and she breathed in the smell of nature, plants, and water. As the ship had closed down after the accident, and the power usage had to be minimized, the biosphere had also become their home. Their old sleeping halls had closed down, the heating turned off, and the biosphere, nowadays, was the only place on the ship that was still open and alive. As she stepped in further, the members approached her with worry etched on their faces. She knew that as a captain, she shouldn't leave the bridge, and coming here unannounced was a sign that something was wrong. Martha, Alicia's aunt and the respected older woman, was the first to greet her. "Has something happened?" she asked. "I found someone on the ship," Alicia said. "Her crew had an accident, and she's the only survivor." A multitude of voices started to talk simultaneously. "Is she okay? What has happened to her? What ship?" "She is okay," Alicia said. "In shock, but okay." "What was she doing in space?" Martha asked. Alicia looked down. "We don't know yet. She's too much in shock to be asked." "Do you think," Martha's voice became a whisper, "that someone is looking for us? Wanting to help us?" Alicia pushed the hope she had to the side, not wanting to presume anything. "We don't know yet," she said. Martha nodded and took her hand in hers. "Go back to her," she said. "Don't leave her alone. We'll talk to her when she's ready." Alicia nodded and left. She knew they had as many questions as her, but it just had to wait. As she arrived back at the bridge, Jeff was on his second story about Dallas, but he looked up as she entered. "How did it go?" he asked. "They know now. It's fine," Alicia said. He nodded, and Alicia turned to Bianca. "I think you need to rest. I'll take you to my cabin for now." Jeff nodded his approval, and said that he would take care of the bridge in the meantime. Bianca stood up, and Alicia took her hand, leading her out of the bridge. They walked in silence through the dark corridors, Alicia taking them to another entrance, the one leading to the cabins. She wanted to keep Bianca shielded, and not overwhelm her with new faces and people. This way, they could get to the cabin almost immediately, and they could stay there until Bianca came out of the shock and calmed down. "Now you'll soon see where we live," she said. She was trying to small talk. But Bianca didn't seem to notice what she had said, and just kept walking next to her. Alicia shook her head and continued walking. As they came to the doorway of the biosphere, Alicia stepped in ahead of Bianca, just to make sure that no one was around. When everything was clear, she beckoned to her to follow, and they stepped inside. The cabins didn't lay far, and soon they could see them on the hills. It was a building project that had been finished in stages, and different types of wooden cabins spread out over the area. "That's where we're going," she said, and pointed towards it. But again, Bianca didn't seem to notice her. But maybe this time it was because she kept staring at the forest. It was the first time Alicia had seen her reacting to something in her surroundings. They arrived at Alicia's cabin, a small but cozy place. It was only meant for sleeping, and the rest of their activities and daily life were spent with the other members in the biosphere. Still, Alicia liked it here. It had a homey feeling to it, and she felt safe staying in her cabin. She sat down on the bed and gestured to Bianca to do the same. By now, Bianca was back to what looked to be a state of shock, and just as in the medical unit, she was serenely watching the room, unaware of anything around her. Alicia wondered if it only was shock, or if there was something else to it too. Because one moment Bianca was crying, and the other, she was watching the room calmly, and she went between the states faster than anyone she'd seen. She shook her head. They would find out, she guessed. They sat in silence, any voices from the biosphere too far away to be heard, and it started to make Alicia feel uncomfortable. Once here, alone with each other, she didn't know what to say or do. But Bianca didn't seem to mind, or even notice the silence. She kept watching the room, calmly, almost vacantly. "So, how are you feeling?" Alicia asked. "I'm fine," Bianca replied. Alicia waited for her to continue, but Bianca had gone back to watching the room. "Once you've rested, I will show you around the ship," Alicia tried. Bianca only nodded, and Alicia couldn't stand it any longer. She stood up. "Are you hungry? I can bring you some food," she said. Bianca turned to her. "Yes, thank you," she said. Relieved to have an excuse to go, Alicia hurried out the door. She would get some food, but she would also go and talk to Jeff and see what he had to say about it. Maybe he could give some advice. Bianca was still sitting on the bed as she closed the door behind her. When Alicia had left, Bianca began to cry on the bed. Because even though Alicia didn't see it, and it didn't show on the outside, the hole inside of her, where Hermes once had been, was still there. It always would be, consuming her. She'd promised him that she would keep living, but most of the time she didn't know how. She would never let anyone in that close again. She couldn't bear to maybe lose them again. But if she didn't, what kind of life would she have? One of loneliness, just as it had been before she met him. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered into the room. The grief moved through her, washing down her face with the tears, and she calmed down. The emotion passed, disappearing into the weave, at least for now. She dried her tears. Outside the door, Alicia was walking onto the porch, a tray in her hand. She stopped to listen by the door, but couldn't hear anything from inside the cabin, so she pushed it open. I didn't know what you liked, so I brought a bit of everything, she said. Thank you, Bianca said. She took the plate and began to eat in silence. Alicia watched her, sitting in the same position as when she had left, as if she hadn't moved at all. But Alicia could see that Bianca had been crying, and she wondered if she should ask about it, not knowing if it would cause her to cry more or if it would help. Bianca finished eating and put the plate to the side. Thank you, she said. Alicia waited for her to continue, but Bianca had already started to watch the small cabin with that look of serenity and calmness she had seen before. She wasn't even sure she noticed that Alicia was around any longer. So she resorted to simply being there for Bianca, and she sat down next to her. Jeff had told her that they needed to give Bianca time to adjust and to calm down from the accident it had. Until then, they could only be there for her. But the silence made Alicia uncomfortable, and in the end, she asked, How do you feel? Maybe it had been the wrong thing to say, because Bianca's face twisted, and all of a sudden she started to cry again. Alicia wanted to run out of the cabin, to get Jeff to help her, but in the end, she forced herself to stay put and keep quiet to not upset Bianca even more. After a while, Bianca stopped, as suddenly as she had begun, and wiped her cheeks. She looked at Alicia. Thank you for asking, she said. Alicia looked at her confused, not knowing what to do about her reaction. Maybe it had been the right thing to say in the end, but why? She didn't know. But Bianca seemed, if not happy, at least calmer, and Alicia wondered if it would be okay to ask her their questions now. Or maybe it was better to wait. Bianca had talked about someone called Hermes, who died. Should she bring it up? She glanced at her. She was watching the room again, her eyes vacant. And not for the first time, Alicia wondered if there was something else behind it all, and not only shock. She kept glancing at Bianca, wrestling with herself whether to ask their questions or stay in the uncomfortable silence. In the end, the discomfort won, and she put a hand on Bianca and said, You said you had lost someone called Hermes. She waited for Bianca to begin to cry, but to her surprise, a smile lit up Bianca's face instead. He was such a beautiful dream ship. Always so curious, she said. He was silly, adventurous, and always wanted to know more. Alicia was taken aback by the love she heard in Bianca's voice. Whoever she had lost, it must have been someone special. What's a dream ship? She asked. Bianca didn't reply. And instead, the air began to flicker, and moments later, a hologram suddenly appeared in the room. Only, it wasn't just a hologram. It looked like a living thing that you could reach out and touch. Alicia should have been afraid, but something about it drew her in, and she stared at it in awe. Geometrical patterns and shapes connected to each other. Smooth curves turned into sharp angles, and when you ran your eyes over the outlines, it suddenly changed direction and transformed into something else. She couldn't have explained it, even if she tried. What is this? She said. How does it work? Maybe Bianca couldn't explain it either, because she didn't reply, but unfastened the bracelet on her wrist and handed it to Alicia. As she took it, something that resembled liquid metal started to flow from it and up her arm. It was the suit that she had seen Bianca wear that first time they met. It flowed over Alicia's body, covering her, and when it reached her face, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes, not knowing if this would be the last she ever saw. But nothing happened, and when she felt Bianca's hand on her, she slowly opened her eyes again. She looked around, and for a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it had done just moments earlier. Then, slowly, something shifted inside of her, and afterwards, as she looked back on it, she couldn't explain it in any other way than that it felt like she'd entered another reality. The room stayed the same, but all of a sudden she felt disconnected from it, as if it didn't exist where she was. You would have thought that it was scary, but instead a sense of peace descended over her. She wanted to ask Bianca about it, but as she formulated the question in her head, the answer came to her instantly. It was as if she'd asked it out loud and got a reply. And all of a sudden, answers to questions she didn't even know she had started to come to her. How this technology worked, how Bianca and Hermes were connected, and where Bianca came from. And it was odd, because it didn't come in words or sentences, but as a knowing. And things just made sense in this new reality. It felt as if she'd always known the answers to these questions. She'd just forgotten about it. A part of her mind told her that that didn't make sense at all, and she wondered how she would explain this to Jeff and the others. She glanced at Bianca, who just smiled knowingly. She felt something shift, and the suit reality started to fade away. Baffled, she looked around to see what had happened. She still sat on the bed, in her cabin, just as she'd done moments earlier, and Bianca sat next to her. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. "So this is what you and Hermes shared?" she asked. "You could say like that," Bianca replied. "I understand that you miss him." She'd always thought that the members of Einstein were close. But what she had seen in that reality was something else. There had been no difference between her and the outside, and had someone been in it, she knew she would have felt them the same as she felt herself. And whatever a dream ship was, it wasn't a machine, but a living being. She put an arm around Bianca. "I'm sorry you lost him," she said. Bianca didn't react, but just sat still, letting Alicia hug her. And it felt petty, saying what she said next. But she didn't know what else to say and wanted to comfort Bianca in the best way she could. "Can't you find someone else?" she asked. "It wouldn't replace him, but you wouldn't be lonely any longer." "I don't want to," Bianca answered. Alicia let go of her, but left a hand on her shoulder. It must have been similar on Einstein, after the accident, she thought. Because even though the members hadn't been connected in the same way as she'd seen in Bianca's reality, they had lost many people. She knew the logbooks talked about not knowing how they would be able to go on, or if they even could. They hadn't been able to abort the mission, but it must have been difficult to even be there for the others when you hurt so much yourself. And at the same time, Alicia knew that that's when they had finally come together as a family, being more than just people sharing the same dream. The ship wouldn't look the same if it hadn't been for that. But still. She remembered a speech from the captain, who had died in the aftermath of the accident. It had been recorded, and to this day, they listened to it once a year, on Memorial Day. It helped them keep going, even in difficult times. Not knowing what else to do, she decided to tell it to Bianca. Alicia knew it by heart. We've been traveling long and far, my friends. Don't let this accident be the end. Keep our vision alive. Keep it close to your hearts. Always remember why we set out on this journey, and know that our sacrifice will bring you forward. And even though we will not be here with you, know that we will always be in your hearts. And the continuation of this journey in this ship is proof enough of the fact that we once existed. So be brave and keep going, and know that we happily do this sacrifice for the human race to find a new Earth. Bianca looked at Alicia once she'd finished. I know it must be difficult to have lost Hermes, Alicia tried. But you can't give up. You need to keep living, even if he's gone. What would he have wanted you to do? Bianca looked at her. She didn't know what to say. She felt trapped, knowing she would spend the rest of her life being lonely if she didn't dare to trust again, and fearing what would happen if she did. Hermes would have wanted her to live. That's why he had saved her. But she couldn't do it. He wanted me to be happy, Bianca said in the end. Of course, Alicia said. But I can't. I don't know how to. Maybe it is possible, Alicia said after a while. After all, the members of this ship managed. Bianca watched the floor. What do you want me to do, Hermes? She thought. She already knew the answer to that. But I can't do it. There is always hope. The words he'd whispered so many times came to her. She'd always believed him. She couldn't stop now. Do you want to be my friend? She asked in the end. I would love to, Alicia said. Bianca took Alicia's hand, holding it in hers. I'm living for you, Hermes. I'm doing it. Something shifted in Bianca after that. It wasn't that she stopped crying. She still often did, sometimes several times a day. But the shock, if that is what it had been, lessened. And she spent less time watching the walls of the cabin. Sometimes, Alicia could even engage her in a conversation that was longer than a couple of words. After several days in the cabin, Alicia began to show her around Einstein. She got to meet the other members, and even spent some time on the bridge, where Jeff proudly showed her the console and how it worked. Alicia didn't ask her what had changed, but simply tried to be there for her, in whatever way she could. But it wasn't only Bianca that changed. Alicia, too, noticed the difference after having worn the suit. The reality she thought she had left behind as the suit faded from her stayed with her. She couldn't read the mind and heart of Bianca, as she had seen Hermes doing. But the openness she'd experienced that day followed her. She realized even more what Bianca had lost, and what she had to lose by trusting again. It wasn't as easy as Alicia had made it out to be. And even the feeling of family they had on Einstein faded in the light of what she experienced. She tried to explain it, even to herself, but never got any further than saying that it felt like her emotions were closer than before. It didn't really capture it. But the sparkles dancing before her, and the glimmer she swore she could see floating in the air, were difficult to explain in words. You would have thought it was a pleasant experience. But more often than not, she was terrified by the feeling of being naked and exposed. Other times, the reality of the suit knocked her over, and she floated together with the sparks. And in those times, she never wanted to come out of it. That's how she'd spent one morning, some weeks after Bianca first had arrived. And maybe that affected what would happen later that day. That afternoon, they sat in the hall in the biosphere, eating dinner with the others. One of the boys, Kim, had taken a liking to Bianca and her almost exotic knowledge, and spent most of his time following her around. Despite being 14 years old, he still hadn't let go of the idea that Einstein could be repaired. It was a phase that most children went through, dreaming that they would be able to find a way for them. But while most of them grew out of it, Kim hadn't. He still sat reading the books from Earth, trying to decipher them, and once he had even tried to understand how to repair the reactor until someone had told him to stop it. He didn't want to cause another accident, did he? Most of the technicians on board had died in the accident or its aftermath, and the knowledge of how Einstein worked had been lost. Alicia knew from the logbooks that the members had tried to find a solution, a way to power the ship without turning on the remaining reactor, but in vain. Kim didn't hurt anyone though, so the adults let him be. He would get over it and drop the subject once he realized it wasn't possible. Today, just like any other day they spent together, he sat next to Bianca, and Alicia could see that he was dying to ask her his questions. He had explicitly been told not to bother her, but Alicia knew that it was becoming an impossible task for him, and in the end, he couldn't hold it, but burst out, "Is your shuttle also powered by nuclear power?" Bianca turned to him. "No, it's powered by the light of the sun and capsuled into liquid that then radiates the vehicle forward." Kim stared at her, trying to understand what she just had said. "But how does that work?" he asked. "By generating enough power in the matrix, the particles will start to shift in the dream world, and that will cause a ripple effect in the space-time continuum. It doesn't mean, though, that future generations won't be able to use that as well." Alicia shook her head, not understanding anything. Neither did Kim, by the look on his face. He tried again. "And you power the whole ship with that?" "No, only the matricula. The nebula is powered by the source of light." Kim stared at her, his face contorted in an effort to try to understand what she was talking about. Alicia could see his lip shaking, and soon tears of frustration rolled down his cheeks. She knew he wanted to understand, but just couldn't get what Bianca was saying. On the other hand, Alicia doubted anyone got what Bianca was talking about. Jeff saw what was happening and came over to them. "Come here, my boy," he said. He put an arm around him and led him over to his seat. Alicia looked at Bianca. "We should go," she said, "before he comes back." Bianca nodded, and they left for Alicia's cabin. Was it the experience from this morning that affected her thoughts as they walked back? She dismissed the idea of repairing Einstein countless times. And just like the other members, had settled on that there was nothing they could do about their situation. But that changed with Bianca. Was it possible to repair Einstein? Or maybe charge him? And would Bianca be able to do it, with her knowledge? She wrestled with the idea, not daring to get her hopes up, and still not be able to let it go. She knew it would be difficult to convince the others. The thought of making any changes to Einstein scared them. And in the end, many of them preferred to live the life they had, with less power and less comfort, rather than risking another accident. But Alicia couldn't put the thought away. It couldn't harm to ask, could it? So once they were back in the cabin and sat down on the bed, she asked, "Would you be able to do something with Einstein?" "What do you mean?" Bianca replied. "Could you fix him? Or charge him?" Bianca looked at her. "Maybe. It might be possible to charge him with my shuttle." For a fleeting moment, Alicia wondered why Bianca hadn't said anything. But on the other hand, she didn't seem to function like other people did. It didn't matter now. Maybe it was possible to repair Einstein. Should she tell the others? No, it was best to leave it, to not upset them or get their hopes up. Alicia forgot all caution she'd had and said, Can we try to do it now?" "Okay," Bianca simply said. Alicia couldn't believe her ears, stood up, and almost pulled Bianca up from the bed. "Well, come on then, let's go," she said. They walked through the empty corridors, Alicia listening for footsteps from any member out on a repair. But they were lucky, and no one was around, and they passed through the first part of the ship unnoticed. Now, as they were walking, she realized they hadn't planned it very well. The spacesuits of Einstein were in poor shape, and she didn't know if they would hold, even for a short journey. She told Bianca, who simply replied, "You can wear my suit." Alicia thought back on the time when she wore the suit, and how it had climbed up her arm, covering her body. How would that work with the two of them? She suspected she would only get a very technical answer though, so she stayed quiet and kept walking. As they came to the airlock, Bianca stopped and said, "Based on the schematics I've seen of Einstein, there is a socket on the outside, meant to be used for external charging. We'll try that." She didn't wait for Alicia to answer, but pushed a button on her bracelet, and the suit floated from it and began to climb up her arm. Its shimmering glow lit up the dark corridor, and once she was covered, she moved closer to Alicia and put a hand on her. The metallic liquid flowed from her hand and over to Alicia, and she tensed. "It won't hurt," Bianca said. Alicia had thought that the experience would be similar to the one she'd had in her room, and she braced herself for the new reality to enter. Instead, it never happened, or at least not in the same way as it had done back then. The glimmer in the air became stronger, and a fleeting memory of how Hermes had been able to feel Bianca's heart and mind passed by before she was enveloped by a sense of peace that made her knees buckle. She looked at Bianca, and in between them, a glimmering cord could be seen. She wanted to reach out and touch it, asking if Bianca could see it too. But her arm wouldn't move, and no words came. The air began to vibrate, and slowly, the reality she'd felt last time in the suit entered. Only, she wasn't alone this time. She felt Bianca, and her presence everywhere. In every fiber of her being, and in each spark floating in the air, she could feel her. And she knew that even if they would be miles apart, she would still feel her, as close as she stood now, knowing what she thought and what she felt. A whisper from a voiceless being floated by. This is what Bianca lost. This is what she shared with Hermes. She felt a tug and looked up. Bianca was moving towards the airlock, and Alicia followed, not sure if her feet ever touched the ground. She watched the corridor, the air shimmering as if it was lit up by countless floating lights. Why hadn't she seen this before? The wall in front of her vibrated, and happenings of the past, of the people who had been here, walking these corridors, flashed before her. Is this what Bianca had seen? As she watched the walls. We need to go, she heard Bianca say. The womb of the new reality embraced Alicia as she followed her out of the airlock and into space. She barely remembered anything as they floated towards the shuttle. All she knew was that she had been lonely her whole life, and now she wasn't. Every particle around her was alive, and she was them, and they were her. They must have reached the shuttle, because Bianca stopped, and Alicia turned to see her entering. She stayed outside, resting in the unseen arms that held her. Once, she had felt fear and worry, but she couldn't remember why any longer. Bianca came back out, connected something to the outside of the shuttle, and said, "It's done." Alicia felt another tug, and they began to float back to Einstein. Bianca must have connected the cable she'd brought from the shuttle to the ship, but Alicia never saw it. She only felt Bianca, her presence, and the particles that had never been separated from her. They climbed back through the airlock, and with a small tap on her wrist, Bianca brought the suit back into her bracelet again. Alicia felt it flowing from her, and slowly, the feeling of peace diminished. The air lost its shimmering, and the particles retreated. Bianca's presence moved further and further away until she couldn't feel her any longer. Left was only an emptiness and a hollow in her chest. The corridor was barren, the walls simply metal sheets, with no memories of the past, and the air nothing else than something you breathed. She was alone. A hole in her chest where, for a moment, there had been something else. A memory she could no longer touch. She reached out, trying to force a connection to Bianca, but nothing happened. The dark corridor seemed to close in on her, shrinking, until there was nothing else than emptiness and a hole left. She was alone. Bianca began to move towards the bridge, but Alicia grabbed hold of her hand. "How can you go on like this?" she asked. Bianca must have understood what she meant, because she said, "Hermes told me there was always hope." Alicia looked around the dark corridor. "How?" "I don't know." There has to be a way, Alicia said. Bianca didn't reply, but took her other hand, holding it in hers. Alicia never knew what happened, but maybe that's when Bianca decided to trust what Hermes had said, because slowly the air began to shimmer, and the hole faded from her chest. Every fiber of her being was filled with Bianca's presence, and Alicia began to cry, throwing her arms around Bianca. She'd forgotten why they had come here in the first place, when the fluorescent lamps in the ceiling suddenly started to flicker. She let go of the embrace, but kept a hand in Bianca's, and she watched them come alive. A warm breeze moved through the corridor, and they looked at each other. It had worked. They were charging. Einstein was charging, and they would have power to use. She threw her arms around Bianca again. It had worked. It had really worked. Alicia smiled and looked at Bianca, and together they walked back towards the bridge and the biosphere. She had thought that they would be able to arrive unnoticed, quietly announcing what they had done. But even before they had come to the bridge, they could hear the voices. As they came closer, she saw that the door to the bridge was open and that the members had gathered there. More things than she'd realized must have turned on when they were charging again. Jeff was the first to see them, and he hobbled over to them. "This is your doing, isn't it?" he smiled. Alicia nodded and explained what they had done and how Bianca had managed to charge Einstein from her shuttle. "Who would have thought?" he said, and hugged her. Alicia looked out over the people gathered on the bridge. Is this how it had been when this journey began, such a long time ago? Full of hope and achievement, and the future in front of them, and anything being possible. They had waited for a long time. But finally, this was their part of the story that they would write about in the logbook, to be read by the generations to come. She smiled, then remembered the biosphere, and she beckoned to Bianca to follow her. This time, they walked through the lit corridors, and Alicia took Bianca's hand. She watched the walls and the floor that she'd barely ever seen in any other light than from the torch. As they came to the entrance of the biosphere, they heard a rumbling from the other side of the door, and she let go of Bianca's hand and ran towards it. Had something happened? As she opened the door, she was instantly soaked by the rain pouring down. She stared at it, not being able to believe her eyes. She had never seen this much of it. She looked at Bianca, laughed, and pulled her inside. The dream of their ancestors returned after that, and room after room was restored. The pages of the logbook once again resembled those before the accident, and the ship began to take the form of how it once had been. As for Alicia, she never asked what had happened that time in the corridor. But whatever Bianca had decided, she stayed with it. Her presence never left Alicia after that, and wherever she went, she could feel Bianca's heart and mind, as if she was standing next to her. She tried to explain it to the other members, but the sparks in the air, the particles carrying the memories of the past, were difficult to put into words. Maybe, one day, they too would be able to experience the suit, when Bianca felt ready to share it. Several years later, they saw an object approaching them on their scanners. As it came closer, Alicia recognized it from the hologram she'd seen so many years before, and Bianca announced that it was indeed another dreamship. Someone had found them. As the crew boarded Einstein, they told them they had been searching for Bianca, and that the distress signal she'd sent out had arrived in the end. They had come to take her back, and offered the people of Einstein to come with them, promising them a place in their world to live in. To their surprise, the members refused, saying that they would find a place of their own. That was what their ancestors had set out to do, and they wouldn't let that vision fall. So instead, the people from Bianca's world offered them the coordinates to a place where they would be able to settle. There would be many generations until they arrived, but knowing that they would fulfill the duty and fulfill what their ancestors had set out to do was enough, and they gladly accepted them. Only Kim decided differently, and when he asked if he could go back with them, they accepted, and he was promised that he would be able to study and learn about their technology. As for Bianca, they told her it was time to finally come home, promising she would have a new dreamship and once again live a life as a navigator. But she had looked at them, and then at the members standing around her, and at Alicia holding her hand. And she knew that she had already found her home, knew that her place in the world was here, and that she had fulfilled the last wish of Hermes.